The taiga in 1939 lay like an immense, breathing organism stitched together from layers of frost, ancient trunks, and a silence so dense that even the wind seemed forced to navigate it cautiously, as though afraid to disturb what had settled there long before human footsteps were imagined. The days were short and metallic, their light filtered through low, oppressive clouds that clung to the treetops with the tenacity of forgotten memories. Dawn arrived reluctantly, spreading colorless illumination over snowpacked paths, collapsed wooden fences, and the heavy outlines of barracks built from thick pine logs whose resin had long since hardened into dark veins visible even in the dim morning. The NKVD outpost, isolated far from rail lines and administrative centers, seemed less like a human construction than a reluctant scar pressed into the forest skin. Sometimes the cold rose from the earth in pale columns, as if the soil itself exhaled. These vapors drifted past the narrow windows of the central administrative cabin, which always smelled faintly of damp paper, ink, and the sourness of boiled uniforms drying over iron stoves. It was in this subdued glow, in this harsh materiality of the taiga's winter breath, that the NKVD lead investigator first entered the story, moving through the morning like a shadow pulled forward by duty rather than will. He appeared at first as a silhouette against the pale, smoky horizon, a tall, rigid man wrapped in a winter greatcoat that looked heavier than the surrounding snow. His steps were deliberate but lacked any sense of haste, as though he carried within him a quiet resignation toward the weight of all unresolved matters awaiting him in this remote corner of the country. Those who had glimpsed him before his arrival at the outpost spoke of a certain manner in his behavior, not exactly cautious, but marked by a stillness that suggested an internal world under perpetual restraint. His gloves were worn at the edges, the leather creased into soft folds near the fingers, revealing that he had spent too many winters in too many unfamiliar places. When he removed them to sign the assignment papers handed to him upon arrival, his hands were pale and slightly trembling, not from cold, but from something far older, a chronic tension embedded deep in his bones. He rarely spoke during those first hours, responding only with curt nods or brief phrases that left the other officers uneasy. Yet he observed everything, the way the shutters rattled in the morning wind, the sheen of ice inside the cracks of the wooden floor, the weary posture of the guards stationed by the door, and the faint scent of damp wool drifting from the coat rack. It was as if he were cataloguing the world around him, committing it to memory, absorbing it slowly and silently through all senses until the environment itself became an extension of his awareness. The settlement surrounding the outpost was small, almost skeletal, its few structures huddled together like animals seeking warmth. Smoke curled upward from chimneys in narrow, hesitant streams, torn apart quickly by gusts that carried the smell of pine resin, frozen earth, and distant fires lit by lumberworkers miles away. The workers' barracks stood crookedly, leaning in unnatural angles as if exhausted by years of winter pressure. Their walls groaned at night, releasing muffled cracks that echoed across the clearing and blended with the calls of unseen birds circling above. People moved through the settlement with the slow deliberation of those who conserved their strength for more meaningful tasks. Children rarely played outside. Instead, they leaned against frosted windows, pressing their small hands to the cold panes, watching the investigators and guards move between buildings. Every person carried in their gaze a kind of subdued wariness, as though the forest itself held dominion over their emotions, dampening hope and sharpening suspicion. Even the dogs patrolling the clearing did not bark often. They trotted silently, sniffing the air, tails lowered, ears constantly turned toward the distant groan of trees shifting under layers of snow. The investigator's introduction to the research team of 12 unfolded gradually, not through formal announcements but through brief glimpses, a group of figures trudging through the snow toward the storage cabin, their breath-forming clouds, whispered conversations around a table cluttered with charts and geologic samples. The rustle of pages turned quickly, almost nervously, as if someone feared the sound might attract unwanted attention. They were not soldiers, nor simple laborists. Their faces bore the pallor of those who spent long hours studying maps, records, and soil cores, yet each carried an aura of anxious curiosity. Most of them had arrived earlier that winter, summoned from different institutions under vague instructions referencing geological anomalies. Their manner of interaction revealed a concealed hierarchy. Some spoke loudly, gesturing with gloved hands stained with graphite, while others remained silent, scribbling notes or shifting uneasily when approached. Their boots left narrow trails in the snow, winding like thin scars toward the forest edge. Though they greeted the investigator with cordial formality, their eyes moved restlessly, searching for reactions, perhaps hoping for reassurances that he did not offer. It was during these early days that the first subtle signs of something unsettled began to surface, though no one addressed them openly. The forest behaved strangely, or so it seemed to those who watched it long enough. Birds that usually nested near the edge of the settlement disappeared without warning, leaving behind empty branches that shook in the wind like skeletal fingers. The air carried an occasional low vibration, felt more than heard, as if a distant engine pulsed beneath the earth. When asked, the research team dismissed the tremors with forced casualness, murmuring explanations about frost heaving or subterranean water. But these excuses rang hollow, especially when spoken by men whose voices tightened and whose gazes flickered toward the tree line before they finished their sentences. During evening briefings, the investigator noticed them exchanging glances, quick, fleeting, weighted, whenever certain topics approached the edge of forbidden curiosity. One scientist avoided mentioning the southern sector entirely, feigning interest in storage inventories instead. Another grew silent whenever someone mentioned the recent absence of small wildlife, hares, foxes, the occasional elk that should have wandered near the settlement during harsh weather but now left no tracks. The buildings themselves seemed complicit in the unease. The wooden walls, swollen with decades of moisture and frost, emitted low creaks at unpredictable intervals, as though straining to articulate warning. Inside the administrative cabin, the oil lamps flickered even when no draft was present, casting unpredictable shadows on documents spread across tables. Dust motes drifted through the lamplight like fragments of old stories refusing to settle. The floorboards shifted under the investigator's weight with a plaintive groan, each sound lingering longer than expected, as if echoing down corridors unseen. At night, the faint metallic clinking of tools left in the workshop carried across the clearing, though the doors were locked and no one moved inside. Some claimed the wind created those noises, rolling loose nails across the floor, but the investigator knew the difference between the wind's random scatter and a deliberate rhythm. Smells played their part as well, subtle yet intrusive. Occasionally a scent of damp stone drifted through the settlement, unnatural in an area where everything should have smelled of wood and frost. It occurred in brief waves, accompanied by a sensation of cold even sharper than the winter air. The researchers noticed it too. Their eyes narrowed, and their conversations faltered when the smell passed. One morning, the investigator found faint traces of mud on the steps of the main cabin, thawed and refrozen into thin, brittle crusts. But no mud existed nearby. The ground remained frozen solid for kilometers in every direction. When he asked one of the senior geologists about it, the man's response was hurried and unconvincing, a muttered line about runoff from melted snow. Yet his voice quivered, revealing the lie more clearly than the footprints themselves. The forest sounds also changed. The investigator, accustomed to long nights in remote territories, sensed the unnatural quiet early on. No branches snapped under the weight of animals. No owls called from the treetops. Instead, the taiga seemed to be holding its breath, listening. Sometimes, late at night when he walked between the outpost and his quarters, he heard a distant, hollow resonance, like wind passing through a deep crevice or through ancient stone corridors buried beneath the ground. It was faint enough to be dismissed, yet persistent enough to disturb sleep, lingering on the threshold of his consciousness, urging him to acknowledge it. He kept these observations to himself, not out of fear but from an instinct honed by years of interrogation work. Premature conclusions could distort truth, and truth in a place like this was fragile, easily obscured by fear or superstition. The research team's behavior grew increasingly strained. Their discussions became shorter, more fragmented, filled with ellipses rather than sentences. One evening, while reviewing field logs, the investigator noticed several entries heavily revised, the original lines scratched out with dark, angry strokes of graphite, leaving impressions etched deep into the paper. The remaining text was vague, almost deliberately so. Words like formation, depth, and structure appeared repeatedly, but always without context. When he questioned the authors, they responded with overly polite, formulaic explanations, delivered with smiles that did not reach their eyes. Their unease revealed itself not in their words but in their hands, fingers tapping rapidly against tabletops, nails digging into fabric, gloves being put on or removed repeatedly in nervous succession. One researcher habitually glanced toward the southern forest as though expecting someone, or something, to emerge from between the frozen trunks. Amid all this, the investigator felt a growing pressure, a sense that the settlement existed on the edge of a precipice concealed by snow and silence. His own fears manifested subtly. He began pausing before opening doors, standing still in hallways longer than necessary, as though listening for a signal. When he walked across the clearing, he occasionally glimpsed shapes moving between trees, perhaps shadows stirred by wind, perhaps animals, perhaps something else. He trained himself not to look twice, for fear that acknowledging these impressions aloud might give them form. He understood the nature of fear that grows in remote places, fear that clings to the mind like frost to glass, forming patterns that resemble truth but melt under scrutiny. Yet this fear felt different, heavier, rooted in something below the surface. With each passing day, the atmosphere thickened. The air itself felt denser, as if crowded with unsaid words and concealed knowledge. Conversations ended abruptly when the investigator entered the room. Lamps flickered more violently. Even the snow seemed to accumulate differently, compacted into unnaturally smooth layers, untouched by wind, as though pressed from beneath rather than falling from above. The researchers ventured into the forest less frequently, and when they returned, they carried with them a silence that felt rehearsed. Their notebooks grew thinner, their footsteps heavier. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time, but still no one dared to say it aloud. As the days folded into one another, the taiga seemed to tighten its grip on the settlement, as though drawing its cold breath inward and preparing to swallow what little human warmth existed there. The disappearance of the researchers had not yet become an official event. No alarms had been raised, no orders had been issued, yet their absence had begun to intrude into the routines of daily life with a quiet inevitability that made denial feel like a last fragile shield against understanding. The NKVD lead investigator noticed the changes the way one notices hairline cracks forming in ice, subtly at first, visible only through reflection, yet increasing in number until they form a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Mornings became more subdued. People spoke softer, walked slower. Doors were opened with a hesitant pause, as if expecting a presence on the other side. The air, already cold, now felt heavier, as though carrying the weight of something unsaid pressing down upon it like a second layer of winter. The research team of 12, once seen crossing the clearing in loose clusters, now appeared in smaller, fractured groups, pairs, or sometimes solitary figures moving briskly between buildings with heads lowered and shoulders tense. Conversations that previously held the rhythm of professional disagreement had turned into muted exchanges conducted in doorframes, half-whispers chased by glances over shoulders. The investigator had begun to notice how often a sentence trailed off when he approached, How frequently someone stepped aside to let him pass with a tight, apologetic smile. How the lines on their faces had deepened not with age but with an invisible burden that clung to them like frost. He had seen fear before, in interrogation rooms, in the eyes of men caught between loyalty and survival, but this was different. This fear did not radiate outward. It folded inward, as though each researcher carried within them a private abyss they could not share. At the mess hall, the silence grew more pronounced each morning. Someone would begin speaking, a casual remark about the weather, the state of the furnace, even a distant rumor from the rail line, but the words always died mid-air, truncated by some invisible boundary. The clattering of spoons against bowls filled the void, echoing too sharply against the wooden walls. When the investigator sat down, the tension condensed almost palpably, like cold dew forming on metal. He noticed how eyes darted away when he raised his gaze, how even the steam from the tea seemed reluctant to rise. One morning, he overheard two researchers mumbling near the doorway. When they noticed him, their bodies stiffened simultaneously, and one of them, with trembling hands, fumbled with his gloves before excusing himself with a hoarse apology that convinced no one. It was on the fourth evening after the disappearances began that the investigator encountered the clearest sign yet that something seeped beneath the surface of their world. He found a notebook left open on a bench near the storage shed, the ink still wet and the pages trembling lightly as though handled only moments before. The writing was hurried, diagonal, the pen strokes uneven and forceful. There were sketches, jagged lines forming incomplete shapes that resembled pillars or archways, though distorted, elongated beyond architectural logic. Under one sketch, a line had been written with evident agitation. "It goes deeper than we thought." No name accompanied the notebook. No signature. When he returned to the cabin an hour later, the notebook had vanished, leaving the bench barren except for a single black smudge where the ink had stained the wood grain. The investigator began questioning the researchers more openly. At first, he framed his inquiries in terms of routine oversight, clarifications of field assignments, verification of supply manifests, requests for precise coordinates of geological survey areas. But each conversation yielded the same evasions, the same subtle shiver in the voice, the same downward flick of the eyes. One researcher, a man with prematurely graying hair and deep creases across his forehead, attempted to maintain composure but faltered when the investigator mentioned the southern sector. His lips trembled slightly, forming a word that never came. Instead, he muttered, I need to finish preparing the samples," and excused himself with abruptness that bordered on panic. Another, when asked directly about the missing members of the team, simply shook her head in a small, tight movement, her jaw clenched as though physically restraining speech. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked fiercely and turned away before any tear could escape, leaving the conversation suspended like a breath held too long. The investigator felt the moral question rising within him, not suddenly, but like cold creeping up a wall by capillary flow. How far should humans go in exploring forbidden knowledge? It echoed inside him, not as philosophy but as a weight pressing against the sternum. He had been trained to suppress such doubts, to smother them beneath the demands of duty and the strictures of state necessity. Yet the isolation of the taiga, the peculiar silence of the forest, and the brittle tension among the scientists stirred something in him that he could not dismiss. At night, lying in the narrow bunk of his quarters, he listened to the distant groans of wood settling under frost and wondered how much the researchers had known before their disappearance. He wondered what had drawn them into the forest, what they had seen beneath the snow-packed earth, and what price they had paid for that knowledge. The thought returned again and again, accompanied by the rhythmic howl of wind against the windowpane. Not everything buried is meant to be unearthed. The world began to fracture in small, nearly imperceptible ways. Tools went missing from the workshop, not stolen, merely absent, as if misplaced by hands no longer fully attentive. A lantern was found extinguished in the middle of the path despite having been filled and lit the previous evening. A set of footprints appeared near the edge of the forest one morning, leading toward the clearing but stopping abruptly halfway, as though the person had been lifted into the air or had stepped into a gap in reality. The soil at the end of the tracks looked disturbed, softer, darker, as if exposed to warmth from below. When the investigator crouched to examine it, he smelled again that faint, unnatural scent of wet stone, sharper now, carrying a mineral sterility that felt foreign to the taiga. Inside the administrative cabin, the air changed first. Papers on the desk curled at the edges overnight, wrinkled by moisture that seemed to come from nowhere. The stove, which should have dried the room, sputtered and hissed intermittently, its iron frame creaking as if resisting some unseen pressure. The oil lamp's flame leaned repeatedly toward the door, even when it was closed, flickering as though responding to a draft that did not exist. The investigator found himself watching these small disturbances with growing unease, sensing that the environment was reacting, not randomly, but purposefully, as though something beneath the surface was stretching upward, testing its boundaries. The remaining researchers, perhaps unconsciously influenced by the same force, moved through the settlement like sleepwalkers caught between their former selves and the tremors of new, unspoken truths. Their gestures became faint echoes of their previous routines. A scientist would lift a notebook only to stare blankly at its cover. Another would draw a line on a map with meticulous care before letting the pencil fall from his fingers, leaving the line incomplete. Their conversations faded into murmurs, interrupted by frequent pauses wherein each person seemed to weigh not what they wanted to say, but what they feared would escape if they spoke too plainly. They gathered more often near the stove in the main cabin, huddled together as though sharing warmth, yet their eyes betrayed no comfort, only the reflection of flames dancing irregularly, as though reacting to an unseen rhythm. One evening, as snow fell in long, silent curtains that blurred the contours of the settlement, the investigator overheard a conversation between two researchers who did not realize he was nearby. Their voices were low, trembling, carrying the timbre of dread wrapped in forced rationality. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," one whispered. "We only mapped the first level." The other responded with a faint, broken sigh. "They kept going. They shouldn't have. We shouldn't have." The words dissolved into silence, followed by a rustle of clothing as they turned away, retreating into the corridor. The investigator remained still, not wishing to confront them, not yet prepared for the burden of knowledge they had inadvertently exposed. The phrase "first level" lodged itself in his mind like a shard of ice, cold and immovable. The consequences of the conflict began emerging more distinctly. Sleep became elusive for nearly everyone in the outpost. Nightmares spread quietly, unspoken yet evident in the hollowed faces of those who emerged from their cabins in the morning. The investigator, too, felt sleep slipping from him. When he did manage to drift into slumber, he dreamed of corridors carved from stone, descending into darkness, pulsing with low vibrations that resembled the faint hum he had heard from a forest. He saw faces, familiar, pale, distorted by shadows, and woke with a start, heart pounding against his ribs. He never spoke of these dreams. To give them voice would be to authenticate them, and he clung desperately to the waning belief that dreams remained separate from reality. On the sixth day, a storm swept across the taiga, driving snow sideways and bending tree trunks beneath its force. The outpost was wrapped in a white shroud, and visibility was reduced to mere steps. Inside, the storm's roar muffled all other sounds, creating a cocoon of anxious stillness. It was during this storm that the investigator found a second sign, a small scrap of paper lodged beneath the door of his cabin, dampened by melted snow. The handwriting matched that of the missing researcher whose notebook had vanished. The message contained only 3 words: "It follows sound." Beneath the words was a crude symbol, a vertical line intersected by two curved shapes, reminiscent of an eye or a narrow doorway. The ink had run slightly, but the urgency of the strokes was unmistakable. The investigator stared at the paper for a long time, the storm raging outside like a distant ocean. He felt the ethical contradiction tightening within him, pulling him toward a reckoning he had tried to delay. The state demanded understanding, classification, containment. His instinct, sharpened by years of interrogations and observations, urged him to dig deeper, to expose the roots of the fear that had spread through the settlement. But another part of him, a quieter, older intuition, whispered caution. Some truths, once uncovered, cannot be buried again. By the time the storm passed, the settlement felt irreversibly changed. The snowdrifts had reshaped the paths, obscuring landmarks and leaving behind new patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The remaining researchers moved more cautiously, as though aware that the world around them had shifted in ways beyond their comprehension. And somewhere in the depths of the forest, beneath layers of ice and soil, something waited, something that had been unearthed, something that had already begun to intrude upon the fragile order of their lives. The cracking of the world did not come as a sudden rupture. It crept forward quietly, viscously, like thawing ice expanding within hidden crevices. Something had been awakened beneath the taiga, and its presence seeped into everything: air, wood, dreams, silence. And though no one dared to speak it aloud, everyone felt the truth pressing against them like a cold hand placed firmly against the spine. The world around the settlement seemed to sag under its own weight as the days passed, as if the taiga itself was slowly folding inward, compressing the buildings, the pathways, the half-frozen river, and even the people into a tighter, more airless space. Snow no longer fell in broad, visible flakes but instead seemed to sift down in fine, almost invisible dust, coating every surface with a pale, flowery film that smelled faintly of resin and iron. Night stretched so far into the late mornings that the distinction between dawn and dusk became blurred, giving the impression that the sun was hesitating in its arc, unsure whether it should rise at all. The settlement's wooden structures groaned with deeper tones now, especially at night. Beams popped sharply, and the metal fixtures of the outpost's entrance gate resonated with a low, uneasy vibration that none of the mechanics could explain. It had grown cold enough that the simple act of exhaling created a brief fog that lingered too long, as though even the air was reluctant to move. Into this thickened atmosphere slipped the first fragments of documents, half-crumpled notes tucked into coat pockets, faint pencil lines smudged across the margins of official folders, and diary entries written in hurried, uneven handwriting. They were not presented deliberately. Rather, they surfaced the way driftwood might rise to the surface of a dark lake, slowly, unexpectedly, carrying the residue of a submerged world. One such note, written by senior researcher Cavern, contained only a few words: "The humming is deeper now. It feels like pressure behind the heart." Another entry, this one torn from a notebook belonging to linguist Zinaida Roshkova, described strange geometric patterns they had encountered in the initial excavation, patterns that seemed to shift slightly depending on the angle of observation, as if made of something neither entirely mineral nor organic. She wrote, "I keep thinking they resemble letters, but letters from no known language. Or perhaps bones shaped into meaning." None of these documents were officially submitted. They appeared in the investigator's hands almost by accident: a folder left on a desk, a page caught in a doorframe, a scrap of paper discovered under a mug in the canteen. Each fragment felt like an unintended confession, a piece of a widening pattern that no one dared articulate fully. And the NKVD lead investigator, already burdened by the creeping moral unease that had formed during the earliest stages of the research, found himself reading these fragments late at night in his cramped office, where a single lamp cast a trembling halo of light over the papers. His breath would fog the cold air, and his hands, no matter how he tried to remain still, would tremble, not from cold, but from the sense that the truth was assembling itself in silence, without permission. The research team of 12, once a cohesive group tightly bound by scientific zeal and state-driven purpose, now appeared fractured in subtle yet unmistakable ways. Their motives, previously aligned, began to diverge like cracks in the frost-covered ground. In overheard conversations, cut short when anyone approached, there were hints of rivalry, fear, ambition, and guilt. The metallurgist Reznikov argued in hushed tones with Kavarin near the storage sheds, their voices strained, interrupted frequently by sudden pauses when the wind shifted. Geologist Sidorova avoided eye contact entirely, speaking in clipped phrases that ended abruptly, as if she feared that words themselves might betray her. And Rushkova, the linguist, had begun waking in the night, gasping, claiming she could hear something beneath the floorboards of her room, something rhythmic, almost like breathing. The investigator noticed everything: the downcast eyes, the trembling hands, the labored exhalations, the way certain members of the team stood slightly apart from the others during mealtimes. His own internal monologue, once sharp and disciplined, had grown blurred by doubt. How far should humans go? He wondered again and again. He had been raised with strict notions of purpose and hierarchy, of the duty to uncover the unknown for the advancement of the state, but now these principles felt porous, unstable. In one of his private reflections, written in a small notebook he kept hidden beneath the floorboards of his quarters, he confessed, "The truth, once unearthed, does not return to the soil. We pretend it can be controlled. But control is a fiction. Something below us knows this better than we do." The documentary elements wove themselves seamlessly into his days. A witness statement from a guard stationed near the excavation site described hearing muffled metallic echoes during the night, like chains dragged across hollow stone, though no equipment was supposed to be in use at that hour. Another testimony, given discreetly by one of the kitchen workers, claimed that she had seen 2 researchers returning from the site at dawn, covered in dust and looking pale, almost translucent, as if drained of blood. But the security logs contradicted her account. According to the records, no one had left the facility after 10 p.m. False leads accumulated like drifting snow, burying clarity under layers of conflicting details. Worse still were the internal conflicts within the team, which grew more tangled by the day. Reznikov accused Sidorova of withholding samples. Sidorova suspected Rushkova of misclassifying the symbols found on the underground structure. Anthropologist Chernov began avoiding the excavation site entirely, claiming he had developed sudden migraines and blurred vision, though a doctor's examination found nothing physically wrong. Each conflict, no matter how trivial it appeared on the surface, carried an undertone of something unspoken, something shared yet unacknowledged, making their interactions feel like a series of quiet detonations muffled beneath layers of duty and fear. Meanwhile, the world outside mirrored these fractures. The weather worsened, wind screamed against the metal siding of the research barracks, and the nights grew so long that the settlement felt displaced from normal time. The buildings sagged with accumulated snow, their roofs bending under the weight like tired shoulders. In the facility's corridors, the lights flickered more frequently, casting elongated shadows that trembled across peeling walls. The echo in the main hallway changed, too. What had once been a straightforward acoustic return now carried a faint, lingering resonance, as though the walls themselves had grown deeper, more hollow. The investigator sensed the shift acutely. Every time he walked through the corridor leading to the archive room, he felt a low vibration beneath his feet, a subtle pulsation that seemed to match the cadence of his heartbeat. He told no one. Instead, he became more attentive to the documents that trickled into his hands, the cryptic sketches of the underground chamber found in Chernov's desk, the the torn page from Reznikov's notebook that described an impossible curvature in the stone, something that seems to fold inward, and a hastily scrawled note from Cavern that read, "If even half of what we found is real, the world above is built on a misunderstanding." These fragments began forming a pattern, one he did not yet dare to name. The discovery's implications pressed against the edges of his thoughts, like a hum behind a wall that grew louder each day, reverberating against the ribs, the skull, the soft tissues of the mind. The others felt it, too. He saw it in the way they flinched at sudden sounds, in their reluctance to descend into the excavation tunnel, in the way each of them seemed to shrink when questioned, as if afraid that speaking openly might trigger something irreversible. And somewhere beneath all of this, beneath the snow-packed earth and the rotting wooden beams of the outpost, beneath the layers of official reports and concealed fears, the underground temple waited, its presence no longer a distant notion, but an emerging inevitability. Its origin, gradually suggested through the scattered documents, no longer felt human. And though no one dared state this openly, the realization swelled like pressure behind the heart, unmistakable, undeniable. The hum was getting closer, and no one could pretend not to hear it anymore. The days preceding the revelation blended into one another with such oppressive monotony that the sole surviving researcher, though no one yet called him that, not aloud, began to perceive time not as a sequence of hours but as a steadily constricting loop, tightening with each breath he drew inside the failing facility. The taiga outside had become a white desert of swirling, horizontal snow, the kind that did not fall from the sky but raced across the land as though driven by some unseen force trying to scour the world clean. The buildings, half-buried and trembling under the force of the wind, looked like relics of a bygone era, their roofs sagging, their windows frosted over from the inside. Even the chimneys exhaled less smoke with each passing day, as if the warmth within the structures were retreating, becoming hesitant, as if recognizing it was out of place in a landscape gradually aligning itself with something ancient and cold. Inside this suffocating stillness, the NKVD lead investigator moved like a man wrapped in layers of invisible fabric, restrained, slowed, dulled at the edges. His footsteps echoed too loudly in the corridors, bouncing strangely off the warped wooden planks, giving the impression that the halls were longer than before, stretching subtly, imperceptibly, as though the architecture were bending in response to the pressures exerted by the underground discovery. He carried with him an air of accumulating fatigue, but also a sharpening, reluctant awareness that the contradiction eating away at him, the conflict between duty and dread, was nearing its breaking point. His internal monologue had grown quiet, almost wordless, replaced by a steady pulse of realization he refused to name. Words were too fragile for what approached. The disappearance of the researchers, one by one, did not occur through dramatic events. It unfolded like the slow erosion of a coastline. Someone would fail to appear for breakfast. Another would not be seen returning from the excavation site. Doors were found ajar where the wind should not have reached. Notebooks were abandoned mid-sentence, pages fluttering as though the writer had simply evaporated. Their absence carried no trace of violence, no blood, no struggle, no sign of forced entry. But this absence was more terrifying than any visible brutality, for it implied a process that followed no human logic. The NKVD investigator documented the vanishings with rigid professionalism, each report written in a hand trembling ever so slightly, the pencil occasionally tearing the brittle paper. He knew the format demanded neutrality, objectivity, calm, but the facts themselves resisted neutrality. Something in the earth below was selecting, calling, or consuming, and the bureaucratic language of the reports only amplified the horror. It was during one of these grim documentation sessions that the only surviving member of the research team, Cavern, though his features seemed to shift subtly each day as exhaustion carved deeper hollows beneath his eyes, approached the investigator. He had always been a precise, careful man, meticulous in his fieldwork, composed even during the harshest weather expeditions. But now his composure had shattered. He moved like someone who had passed through a place the human mind was never meant to enter and returned altered. His speech was fragmented, dissolving into whispers that trailed off as though he feared something might overhear. At times he would pause mid-sentence, eyes widening slightly, focusing on a point over the investigator's shoulder where nothing visible stood. Caverin's notes, collected over the past weeks and found scattered throughout the excavation site, were now spread out on the investigator's desk like a map of a disintegrating psyche. The writings oscillated between detailed scientific observations and cryptic fragments that bordered on hallucination. In one entry he described the inner chamber of the underground structure, noting the anomalous curvature of its walls, the absence of tool marks, the strangely warm temperature of the stone despite the sub-zero conditions outside. Another passage, written later, the handwriting jagged, mentioned a low-frequency resonance that seemed to emanate from beneath the chamber floor, a resonance that induced vivid dreams. The dreams, he explained, were not his own. Or if they were, then the origin of the images could not be traced to anything he had ever consciously known. When Caverin spoke of the chamber to the investigator, his voice carried the depleted quality of someone recounting a funeral. "It isn't a temple in any sense we understand," he said, rubbing his hands together as if trying to restore warmth to his fingers. "It received them. The others. It receives what answers the call." He did not elaborate further. His eyes glazed with a kind of internal reflection, as though he were listening to something deep within himself or far below the frozen earth. The silence that followed stretched unbearably long, filled only by the faint creaking of the walls and the distant growl of the wind pressing against the outer structures. The investigator's moral conflict, how far humans should go in the pursuit of forbidden knowledge, reached its sharpest edge then. Staring at Caverin, he realized with devastating clarity that the question was no longer hypothetical, no longer philosophical. It was immediate, concrete, and fatal. The documents, the disappearances, the oppressive atmosphere, they were all converging toward a point of no return. He recognized that the decision was no longer under human control. Something had been set in motion the moment the first layer of soil was disturbed above the underground structure. Human intention had become irrelevant. Human resistance was nothing more than a formality. The realization came to full clarity when Caverin finally agreed, reluctantly, with visible dread, to guide the investigator to the inner chamber one last time. They descended the narrow tunnel, each step echoing with unnatural resonance. The air grew warmer, thicker, almost humid, carrying faint metallic undertones. The light from the lamps bent strangely, casting elongated shapes that trembled along the uneven walls. As they moved deeper, the hum Caverin had described became increasingly perceptible, not merely audible, but felt, a deep vibration pressing against bone and blood, a pulsation that matched no rhythm of the human body. The investigator's breath grew shallow, his pulse quickened, not out of panic but from a sense of inevitability, as though he were approaching a conclusion he had known all along but refused to accept until now. The chamber itself defied comprehension. Its size was indeterminate, its boundaries blurred by the glow emitted from the inscriptions carved, or rather, formed, into the stone. The patterns resembled a language, yet no language shaped by human cognition could curve in such impossible geometries. The symbols seemed to shift subtly, rearranging themselves at the edge of perception. The investigator's lamp flickered, its beam briefly revealing what lay beneath the translucent surface of the stone floor. Movements, slow and deliberate, like something vast stirring in deep water, obscured but undeniably animate. It was then that Caverin spoke the words that sealed the truth. "It's not ancient. It's not abandoned. It's not dead." His voice cracked on the last word, the sound echoing unnaturally in the chamber, as though reflected by layers of air and stone with impossible precision. He placed a trembling hand on the investigator's shoulder, gripping too tightly, his fingers cold despite the chamber's warmth. It found us long before we found it. The others, they didn't disappear. They were recognized. The documentary nature of the moment, its clear, factual inevitability, struck the investigator with the force of a collapsing structure. There was no confrontation, no frantic attempt to escape, no outburst of emotion. Instead, there was an overwhelming, crushing acceptance. Humans had not uncovered something buried by time. They had disturbed something waiting beneath the thin veneer of their understanding of the world. Something that predated them. Something that did not communicate through words or symbols but through resonance, through selection, through presence. Cavern's final confession, whispered as though addressing the chamber rather than the investigator, confirmed the non-human origin. It isn't hostile. It isn't benevolent. It isn't anything we can categorize. But it sees. It remembers. And once it remembers you, it doesn't let go. Moments later, though time had lost all meaning, Cavern stepped forward, toward the shifting glow. His silhouette blurred, not swallowed but absorbed, his form dissolving into the light without a cry, without resistance, as though returning to a place he had always belonged. The investigator, paralyzed by the enormity of what he had witnessed, could only stand motionless, feeling the hum rise through his bones, filling the hollow spaces of his chest. He felt his own thoughts begin to thin, replaced by a cold, documentary-like awareness. This was the truth. This had always been the truth. When he finally fled the chamber, if fled was the correct word, the world had already changed. The corridors felt empty not because people were gone, but because something deeper than absence had settled into the air. The taiga outside roared not with mere wind, but with a sense of the land shifting imperceptibly under unseen pressure. The investigator's report, written later with hands that no longer fully felt like his own, contained only a single, devastating line. We were not the first to find it. We were the last to think we could understand it. The facts were colder than any emotion. The truth had no comfort. And the survivor understood, with hollow certainty, that he had not truly survived at all. In the weeks that followed, the settlement in the taiga seemed to sink deeper into itself, as if the land, heavy with snow and older burdens, was swallowing the memories of what had occurred. The buildings stood half-buried and darkened, their windows fogged by the breath of people who no longer spoke as freely as before, their walls holding the final echoes of the vanished research team. Inside the barracks, the corridors felt longer, the lamps dimmer, the air thicker with the smell of cold iron and damp wool. Conversations dissolved at the slightest sound, replaced by long stretches of silence broken only by the crackling of stoves that had begun to burn lower, as though fuel and spirit were both running out. People moved more slowly, glancing behind themselves without knowing why, lowering their voices even when discussing mundane matters, as if aware that something buried beneath the settlement had awakened to a patient, wordless listening. The NKVD lead investigator wrote his report for superiors with a detachment that was not feigned but born of a profound hollowness. His handwriting had lost its former precision, the lines bent slightly, drifting like smoke from a dying fire. He tried to reconstruct the sequence of events as rationally as possible, aligning dates, testimonies, fragments of notes from the vanished researchers, but every attempt left behind glaring lacunae that no bureaucratic language could fill. He found himself rewriting sentences, then crossing them out, then rewriting them again with fewer words, as if stripping away language could strip away the horror. In the end, the report read more like a chronicle of absences than an accounting of facts, a listing of names whose fates had receded into a place beyond human intervention. He submitted the file without expectation and received no immediate response. The silence from above felt oddly fitting, as if the higher officers, too, understood that some truths were better left without official acknowledgement. Outside, the winter continued its relentless advance, making the settlement feel like a pocket of dim light suspended in an endless, indifferent whiteness. The remaining workers avoided the excavation site, though officially it had been sealed. Unofficially, they admitted, only in hushed tones, that sometimes at night they felt faint vibrations through the soles of their boots, a low thrum rising from deep below, pulsing through the frozen earth in irregular intervals like the slow heartbeat of something vast and patient. A few claimed they had seen distant glimmers beneath the snow, soft blue flickers emerging from the fractures in the ground before disappearing again. Others dismissed these stories as tricks of exhaustion or reflections of lanterns, yet even they spoke with the strained calm of people who feared their own disbelief. The investigators' sleep grew shallow and fragmented. Dreams came in waves, not overt nightmares but formless impressions, curved walls glowing faintly, patterns shifting at the edge of perception, a warmth that did not belong to the surface world. He woke often with the drumming hum echoing in his skull, unsure whether it had followed him to the waking world or had merely seeped too deeply into his memory to be distinguished from genuine sound. On some mornings he would rise to find his notebook open beside his bed, filled with illegible marks that looked halfway between writing and trembling. He tried to attribute this to fatigue, but a persistent unease gnawed at him, whispering that the chamber beneath the earth had imprinted itself on more than just his recollection. It had marked him in ways no medical examination could detect. The official stance eventually arrived in the form of a terse directive. The excavation was to be classified, the remaining personnel reassigned, the settlement gradually phased out under the guise of resource reallocation. No further studies were to be conducted. All remaining materials were to be archived, sealed, forgotten. The unspoken message lay between the lines. This never happened. Let it die in silence. Yet the investigator knew such things did not die. They lingered, not as stories but as pressure points beneath the skin of the world, waiting. As the settlement emptied, belongings were left behind, coats hanging from pegs, mugs still faintly stained by tea, notebooks partially completed, boots lined neatly by doors. These remnants made the buildings feel inhabited by absence rather than people, as though the departing personnel had left their shadows behind. The investigator spent long evenings walking through these rooms, running his hand along rough wooden walls, breathing in the still air tinged with soot and resin. He collected the leftover papers and packed them into crates, though he doubted anyone would ever read them. He paused longest in the room of cavern, whose presence lingered in the meticulous arrangement of objects, instruments laid out with careful precision, sheets of calculations pinned above the desk, a single chair pulled slightly back as though he had just stood up to greet someone. The investigator found a final notebook locked in the drawer, its contents filled with dense sketches, spirals, radiating lines, geometric shapes that curved in impossible ways. On the last page, written in hurried strokes, were the words, "It remembers us because we remembered it first." The weather worsened further as the final evacuation drew near. Night stretched into long, unbroken passages of darkness, the kind that crushed depth perception and made every window reflect the room behind it instead of revealing the world outside. The wind shifted its tone, carrying low moaning sounds across the rooftops that some mistook for voices before shaking off the thought. The investigator walked alone through the snow one evening, approaching the sealed entrance to the excavation site. The boards nailed across it creaked softly, and he thought he felt warmth radiating through the wood, though his gloved hand registered only the familiar, biting cold of the taiga. He stayed there for a long time, listening, waiting, though for what he did not know. When he finally turned back, he had the unsettling impression that the door behind him had exhaled. On the final day before departure, he recorded his own testimony in a private notebook, separate from official documents. His writing was slow, heavy, deliberate, as if chiseling the words into stone. He described the facts sparingly, but the atmosphere filled the spaces between the sentences. The changing air, the slow vanishings, the hum, the warmth of the chamber. He did not claim understanding. He did not draw conclusions. Instead, he ended the account with an admission. Some discoveries are not found, they awaken. And once awake, they do not sleep again. He tucked the notebook into his coat, uncertain whether he intended to preserve it or bury it somewhere in the snow where no one would ever find it. When the trucks finally carried the remaining men away, the settlement receded into the storm like a memory dissolving into a half-dream. Through the icy windows, the investigator watched the buildings grow smaller, their outlines blurred by falling snow, until they disappeared entirely into the white expanse. No one spoke during the journey. No one looked back. But long after the settlement vanished from sight, the investigator felt a faint tremor rising through the vehicle's frame, a vibration too rhythmic to be attributed to the engine, too deep to be wind. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment the warmth of the underground chamber seemed to pulse beneath his ribs. The sensation passed quickly, but not without leaving behind a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the weather. Years later, if one follows the trail of declassified fragments and half-burned reports, there appear scattered records, anonymous statements of faint resonances heard during later geological surveys, unverified accounts of lights beneath the snow in remote areas, abrupt personnel transfers with incomplete explanations. Each document stands alone, thin and ambiguous, yet together they form a quiet chorus that suggests the underground structure was never truly silent, never fully sealed. The taiga, vast and indifferent, holds its secrets with an ancient patience, allowing only glimpses of something older and deeper than human comprehension. The final archival fragment in the file contains no author, no date, only a single typed line preserved on yellowing paper. What we uncovered was not a ruin, but a memory. And memories, once stirred, are impossible to bury again. The document ends there, the page marred by a faint ripple as though touched by dampness long ago. And the silence that follows is not empty. It waits.